In the summer of 1982, a repairman opening a taxi's trunk made a discovery that froze Hong Kong in silence. Inside were photographs, reels of 8mm film, and a collection of glass jars filled with preserved human tissue. The driver, 27-year-old Lam Kor-wan, worked the night shift, ferrying passengers through Kowloon's neon streets. According to police reports, his hobby was photography, his apartment lined with equipment and labeled film canisters. But when detectives developed the negatives, they realized they were holding a record of multiple murders, all committed by the same man. He had documented everything, frame by frame. That footage would become evidence in one of Hong Kong's most haunting trials, a story still whispered in police academies today. August 1982. Hong Kong was still humid from the typhoon season. A taxi sat in a Mung Kok repair garage waiting for routine maintenance. When the mechanic lifted the trunk mat, he noticed two things: a strange chemical odor and a camera bag. He unzipped it. Inside were rolls of film and a metal case filled with neatly labeled jars. At first he thought they contained preserved animal specimens, until one label read, "Human sample." Police were called within minutes, according to the official incident report. The car was registered to Lam Kor-wan, 27, a night shift taxi driver who lived with his family in a small flat on Ma Tau Y Road. Detectives arrived before dawn. They photographed every inch of the vehicle. Careful not to disturb the evidence the following morning, Lam drove into the station on his own. He had heard from colleagues that officers were looking for him. He appeared calm, even curious, asking politely if he could see what had been found inside the precinct. Investigators opened one of the jars in front of forensic staff. The contents matched missing person bulletins from earlier that summer. The discovery triggered a citywide search of Lam's home. Court documents later confirmed what they found there: a small bedroom converted into a dark room, 8mm film reels, photographic prints, and preserved biological material. Neighbors told reporters he was quiet, punctual, the kind of man who never made eye contact. His father described him as a loner who liked cameras more than people. By nightfall, the headlines read, "Taxi driver held in murder inquiry." It was the first hint that Hong Kong had uncovered something far worse than an isolated crime, a methodical documentation of violence. Kept like a diary, the evidence would reveal a man who treated reality like film stock. Developing horror in his own home, Lam Kor-wan was born in 1955, the eldest son in a working-class family in Hong Kong's Yo Ma Ti district. He attended secondary school, quiet and average by every account. Teachers remembered him as polite and visible when he finished school. Lam enrolled in an electrical engineering course and later trained as a taxi driver. He liked night shifts. The roads were empty, the city quiet enough to hear himself think. Colleagues told investigators he often carried a camera in the passenger seat. Photographing city lights between fares, photography was his refuge. He processed film in his bedroom, learned how chemicals could freeze a moment forever. Police later called that habit the key to his psychology, a man obsessed with control, framing, and permanence. Court files note that Lam's social life was minimal. He spent most evenings alone, eating in the same noodle shop before work. One neighbor described him as someone who spoke as if rehearsing. Another said she once saw him filming stray cats near his building. Precise, patient, detached, according to psychiatrists who testified at his trial. Lam showed traits of social withdrawal and deep isolation. He kept meticulous journals of his shifts, noting passenger routes and moods like data points. That documentation mirrored the photographs later found in his apartment, clinical. Labeled and devoid of empathy, investigators pieced together his life through receipts, schedules, and camera negatives. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its normality. A man who followed routines, who lived in a city of millions yet spoke to almost no one. When reporters asked a senior detective what Lam was like in person, he paused. Then he said, "He looked at people the same way he looked through a lens, waiting for them to stay still." Within hours of Lam Kor-wan's arrest, detectives from the Kowloon Regional Crime Unit sealed his apartment. They worked in silence, cataloging each object with numbered tags, every camera, every roll of film, every jar. Forensic logs list more than 400 photographs, a dozen 8mm reels, and preserved biological material stored in formaldehyde. Technicians developed the film in a police laboratory. Frame by frame, scene by scene, each reel documented his nightly routes through Hong Kong, his passengers, his apartment. It was not chaos. It was order. Investigators later said the precision unsettled them more than the content. Every shot was measured, labeled with date and exposure time. He had recorded not impulse, but planning, fingerprints. Trace DNA and the victim matching process took weeks. According to the coroner's report, at least 4 women were identified through missing person files from 1981 to 1982. All had been young, traveling alone late at night. The evidence suggested Lam selected victims randomly, then returned to his darkroom to preserve what he considered his subjects. Court testimony from Senior Inspector Lau Pak Lai described the apartment as a private archive of violence. The words later became a headline that defined the case. Forensic psychologist Dr. Raymond Cheung told the High Court that Lam's obsession with photography converted real life into images he could control. He was not driven by revenge or lust, but by a compulsive need to freeze people in a state of permanence. When the evidence was presented in court, reporters noted how the audience fell completely silent. One by one, the photographs appeared on a projection screen, not shown to the public, only to the jury. It was the first time Hong Kong had confronted a killer who used technology not to hide his crimes, but to curate them. Lam Kor-wan's trial began in the High Court of Hong Kong in 1983. Crowds lined up outside each morning, journalists carrying notebooks instead of cameras. The court forbade photographs. Inside, the mood was still and clinical, like an anatomy lesson delivered through law. Prosecutors presented weeks of evidence, the film reels, the preserved samples, and the photographic prints recovered from his flat. Each exhibit was handled behind screens to protect the public from what jurors were asked to see. The defense did not dispute the killings. Instead, they argued insanity, claiming Lam's compulsions erased his sense of reality. Psychiatrists for the Crown disagreed. Their assessments, read aloud in court, described a man who understood what he'd done, recorded it deliberately, and organized his life around repetition. He was, they said, rational, driven by obsession, not delusion. Witnesses spoke of his precision, receipts logged by the minute, cleaning supplies purchased in sequence, photographic notes written in technical jargon. Prosecutor Clifford Lau summarized it simply. He treated murder as a process to be perfected. On August 8, 1983, the judge delivered his verdict. Lam Kor-wan was found guilty on 4 counts of murder and sentenced to death. The gallery exhaled quietly, as if the city itself had been holding its breath. A year later, under Hong Kong's evolving penal code, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Since then, Lam has remained in Stanley Prison, one of Asia's oldest correctional facilities. He never appealed. Prison staff describe him as polite, reserved, and endlessly routine, still organizing his day by time slots, still requesting photography magazines from the library. For Hong Kong, the verdict closed the case legally, but not psychologically. The files, sealed in archival boxes, became a permanent reminder that order can disguise horror more effectively than chaos ever could. When the verdict was announced, Hong Kong stood still. Newspapers carried the story for weeks, printing only courtroom sketches, never the photographs. Headlines called him the Jars Murderer, a name that would outlive the trial itself. In an era before the internet, news traveled by word of mouth. Taxi drivers whispered about it on late shifts. Parents warned daughters not to ride alone at night. The city's nightlife dimmed. Fear settled quietly into routine. Editorials debated whether the coverage was ethical. Some argued that the press had turned tragedy into spectacle. Others said documenting the case was a civic duty, proof that even the safest cities could hide something unimaginable. Television anchors read statements in hushed tones, their voices carrying more caution than outrage. Sociologists later called the public reaction a form of collective disbelief. People didn't see Lam Kor-wan as monstrous. They saw him as invisible proof that evil could wear the face of normality. For a society defined by order and efficiency, that realization struck deeper than fear. The government quietly introduced new licensing checks for night shift taxi drivers. Colleges added criminal psychology electives to study the case. In time, the story faded from headlines but remained in urban folklore. Older residents still recall the photographs that were never printed, the evidence described but never seen. When digital archives opened decades later, journalists revisiting the files found the language in the police reports strikingly formal. Each horror described with bureaucratic restraint, no adjectives, no emotion, just facts. That restraint mirrored the city's own reaction, silent, methodical, determined never to let something like this happen again. For Hong Kong, the case became less about violence and more about reflection. It revealed how a modern city processes horror, not through noise but through control. Decades have passed since Lam Kor-wan's conviction, but his name still surfaces in the margins of Hong Kong's history books. The court files remain sealed in climate-controlled storage. The photographs are locked away in police archives, never to be released. Every few years, a documentary crew petitions to review them. The answer is always the same, not for public display. For criminologists, the case marked a turning point. It was the first time local investigators confronted evidence created by the killer himself, a self-documented archive of crime. Today, that concept is studied in cyber forensics courses as auto-surveillance pathology. It taught law enforcement how technology could transform a private obsession into a permanent record. Psychologists use Lam's file to illustrate the spectrum between isolation and control. He was neither a mastermind nor a madman, just a man who mistook permanence for connection. His photographs, stripped of context, now serve as training examples for pattern analysis. Not horror, they've become data points. Not memories for the public, the case has become myth. You can still hear it mentioned on late-night radio, always with a disclaimer, based on true events. Younger listeners think it's urban folklore. Older ones remember the silence that followed the headlines. In Stanley Prison, Lam remains quiet. He's never spoken publicly since 1983. Prison records describe him as cooperative, withdrawn, aging into anonymity. He spends most days reading manuals on photography, the same subject that once revealed everything about him. Hong Kong changed around him. Skyscrapers rose. Neon lights dimmed, and the city learned to live online. But the lesson of the jar's murderer endures. It reminds investigators that documentation is not understanding, and that the lens, once turned inward, can become the most dangerous witness of all. If you thought the horror ended here, you're wrong. What other dark rituals and forbidden practices are still being performed in secret? Dive deeper into the chilling world of haunted ceremonies, banned footage, and eerie folklore that refuses to stay buried. Click on the playlist to uncover terrifying recordings, lost evidence, and disturbing stories they never wanted you to see. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for weekly uploads of spine-tingling footage and dark tales that echo from the shadows. This is the Forbidden's Archive, where the hidden truth and haunting evidence come to life.